The polished floors of the grand downtown bank gleamed under the afternoon sun streaming through its towering glass windows. Customers shuffled in and out, briefcases in hand, papers rustling as they queued for service. Among them was a sharply dressed man, his tailored suit and polished shoes hinting at both wealth and power. But today, what should have been a routine banking transaction was about to spark a story that would ripple through the city and beyond. Meet Marcus Turner, a self-made millionaire. His journey was anything but ordinary. Born into a modest household, Marcus worked tirelessly to build a thriving real estate empire. Years of sacrifice, grit, and determination had brought him here, to a point where his financial portfolio could turn heads in any corporate room. Yet, despite his undeniable success, today would remind him that not everyone looked past his skin color. As Marcus stepped up to the ornate counter, a faint smile graced his lips. He greeted the bank manager, a woman in her late 40s named Helen Carter. Dressed in an immaculate navy blazer with her hair pinned back into a tight bun, Helen radiated an air of authority. She glanced at Marcus briefly, her eyes narrowing as they scanned him from head to toe. Something shifted in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, a hint of disdain, cloaked behind the veneer of professionalism. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone clipped, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Marcus explained calmly that he needed assistance with a large transaction involving one of his property acquisitions. He slid a sleek folder across the counter, filled with all the necessary documentation. Helen took it but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she hesitated, her fingers resting on the edge of the folder as her gaze darted back to Marcus. "Are you sure you're in the right place for this sort of thing?" she said, her voice tinged with doubt. The question hung in the air like an accusation. A few heads in the lobby turned, sensing the tension. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied evenly, his tone unwavering. "I've been a client here for years. This transaction should be straightforward." Helen's skepticism deepened. She opened the folder and scanned its contents, her lips pressing into a thin line. To anyone watching, it was clear she was stalling. Her questions soon shifted from professional to condescending, probing Marcus about his business in ways that bordered on the invasive. Her words weren't loud, but the implications behind them echoed through the room. "What's someone like you doing here?" By now, whispers had begun to spread among the customers. Some watched with uncomfortable curiosity, others with visible disapproval. A younger teller at the adjacent counter glanced at Marcus sympathetically but seemed too nervous to intervene. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up his spine. But he refused to let it show. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm, "if there's a problem, I'd appreciate it if you told me directly." Helen gave a tight-lipped smile, her tone dripping with faint politeness. "No problem at all, Mr. Turner. But transactions of this nature are highly sensitive. We need to ensure everything checks out." "And yet," Marcus replied, raising an eyebrow, "you haven't made a single call or even looked up my account." Helen stiffened, caught off guard. The room grew quieter. Marcus's words were firm but laced with a measured authority that demanded respect. Yet Helen seemed determined not to back down. She closed the folder with a snap and placed it on the counter, her smile now entirely gone. "I'll need to consult with our compliance department," she said, her tone icy. "It could take some time." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his patience thinning. He wasn't a stranger to encounters like this, but that didn't make them any less infuriating. Still, he knew better than to let his anger dictate his actions. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back from the counter, giving her one last look, a quiet, resolute warning in his eyes. "Take your time," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be waiting." As Marcus walked away, Helen's gaze followed him, her expression unreadable. But what she didn't know, what no one in that bank knew, was that Marcus wasn't just any client. He was a man with connections, influence, and a platform. And he wasn't about to let this encounter go unnoticed. Settling into one of the plush lobby chairs, Marcus pulled out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly, composing a message that would set wheels in motion. Across the city, an influential friend received the text and immediately made a call. Marcus didn't need to spell out the details, the situation was clear enough. By the time Helen returned to the counter, she would be blindsided by a storm she never saw coming. But for now, Marcus waited, his calm exterior betraying none of the brewing tension. Customers around him exchanged murmurs, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. What would happen next? Would Helen realize the magnitude of her mistake before it was too late? Or would she dig herself deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of? As the clock ticked on, The air in the bank grew heavy with suspense. Marcus sat patiently, his presence commanding attention without a single word. And somewhere in the distance, the first domino had already fallen. To be continued? Marcus tapped his foot lightly against the marble floor, his face a mask of calm determination. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He had seen this before, prejudice thinly veiled as procedure, the subtle indignities that he and others like him were forced to endure time and time again. But today felt different. Today, Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. From her desk, Helen Carter watched Marcus with a mixture of irritation and unease. Something about him unnerved her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in his demeanor, or the fact that he hadn't stormed out in frustration like others might have. Instead, he sat there, waiting as if he already knew the outcome of this standoff. Helen turned to her assistant manager, a young woman named Clara, who had been quietly observing the situation. Clara's expression betrayed her discomfort, but she avoided making direct eye contact with Helen. "Clara," Helen said sharply, pulling her out of her thoughts. "I want you to double-check Mr. Turner's account history. Make sure everything is in order before we proceed." Clara hesitated. "I've already reviewed his file earlier, ma'am. Everything is perfectly fine. His transaction is legitimate." Helen frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Just do as I ask. I don't want any mistakes." Clara gave a small nod, though her stomach churned. She had seen Helen's behavior before, a pattern of extra scrutiny directed at certain customers. It wasn't outright discriminatory, but the undertones were clear. Clara had never felt brave enough to speak up about it, but something about today felt different. Meanwhile, Marcus's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a response from his friend, Trey. The text was short but reassuring. On it, "Give me 15 minutes. Trey was more than just a friend, he was a well-connected media executive who had a knack for exposing injustices. If Helen thought her actions would go unnoticed, she was sorely mistaken. Marcus sent a quick reply before leaning back in his seat, his mind flashing back to a conversation he'd had with Trey just weeks earlier. They'd been discussing the importance of holding people accountable, especially those in positions of power who abuse their authority. Little did Marcus know, he'd soon have to practice what he preached. Behind the counter, Helen busied herself with other tasks, trying to mask her growing unease. She had expected Marcus to give up and leave by now. Instead, he sat there like an immovable force, his presence a constant reminder that her decisions were being watched. The lobby, too, felt different, quieter, more alert. Customers whispered among themselves, and even the other tellers seemed unusually subdued. Clara returned after a few minutes, a stack of papers in hand. "Here's everything you asked for, ma'am," she said, her tone neutral. "Mr. Turner's account is impeccable. He's been a client here for nearly a decade, and his financial records are exemplary." Helen barely glanced at the papers. "Thank you, Clara. I'll handle it from here." But Clara didn't leave. She stood there for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ma'am, if I may. I think we should process his transaction. There's no reason to delay further." Helen's eyes snapped up, her expression hardening. "Clara, I don't need your input on how to do my job." Clara flushed, her heart pounding. "Of course, ma'am. I just thought, you thought wrong," Helen cut her off. "Now get back to work." Clara bit her lip, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She cast a quick glance at Marcus, who met her gaze with a subtle nod of acknowledgement. It was as if he could sense her inner turmoil, and in that brief exchange, Clara felt a flicker of resolve. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room grew thicker. Marcus's phone buzzed again, and this time, the message from Trey brought a faint smile to his lips. "Check your email." Opening the attachment, Marcus found a detailed press release Trey had drafted, highlighting the encounter. It was professional yet pointed, outlining the situation without naming names, yet. Attached were details about Marcus's achievements, his philanthropic efforts, and his long-standing relationship with the bank. Trey's message was clear: if this wasn't resolved swiftly, the story would go public, and the fallout wouldn't be pretty. Marcus stood, his tall frame commanding attention as he walked back to the counter. Helen looked up, her expression guarded. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'd like to know the status of my transaction. It's been quite some time." Helen hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. "As I mentioned earlier, these things take time. I'm simply following protocol." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand the importance of protocol, but I also understand when it's being used as an excuse. Let me be clear, I've done nothing to warrant this delay, and I won't tolerate being treated unfairly." Helen bristled, but before she could respond, the glass doors of the bank swung open, and a man in a sharp gray suit strode in. His presence was commanding, his steps purposeful as he made his way to the counter. It was Richard Hayes, the regional director of the bank, and one of the most respected figures in the industry. "Mr. Turner," Hayes said warmly, extending a hand. "I came as soon as I heard there was an issue." Helen's face drained of color. "Mr. Hayes," she stammered, "I wasn't aware." Hayes held up a hand, cutting her off. "I've already been briefed." He turned back to Marcus. "On behalf of the bank, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today. Your transaction will be processed immediately." The room fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding scene. Helen opened her mouth to protest but quickly shut it when Hayes shot her a sharp look. Marcus shook Hayes's hand, his expression calm but resolute. "I appreciate your intervention, Mr. Hayes. However, this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that every customer is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background." Hayes nodded, his gaze shifting to Helen. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Turner. And I assure you, steps will be taken to address this matter internally." Helen's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she said nothing. Clara, meanwhile, felt a wave of relief and quiet satisfaction. As Marcus's transaction was finally processed, he glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of several onlookers. The message was clear: stand up, speak out, and never let injustice go unchecked. But as he left the bank, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. For every Helen Carter exposed, there were countless others hiding behind facades of professionalism. And for Marcus, the fight for equality was far from over, to be continued. As Marcus stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the murmur of the bank's lobby still echoing faintly in his ears, he allowed himself a moment to exhale. But his mind was far from at ease. This wasn't just another unpleasant encounter. It was a glaring reminder of how far society still had to go, even in spaces that claimed to value equity and professionalism. He glanced at his phone again. Trey's press release still open, the weight of its potential impact pressing down on him. Across the street, a silver sedan idled at the curb, the driver's window rolled down. It was Trey. Always one to take action, he'd decided to show up in person, his sharp instincts telling him the situation might need more than a few carefully chosen words. Marcus crossed the street, slipping into the passenger seat. "Didn't think you'd come," Marcus said, his tone dry but tinged with appreciation. Trey smirked, adjusting his aviator sunglasses. "Come on, man. You think I'd miss this? I've been waiting for a moment like this to blow up one of these so-called institutions of integrity." His tone was light, but there was a fire in his eyes. Marcus nodded but said nothing. His silence was heavy with thought. He wasn't one for spectacle or making a scene, he preferred quiet, calculated moves. Yet, a part of him couldn't deny the allure of holding people like Helen accountable on a grand stage. "So, what's next?" Trey asked, his voice breaking into Marcus's thoughts. "Do we pull the trigger? Or are you going to give them a chance to clean this up internally?" Marcus hesitated, his fingers drumming against the dashboard. "Hayes seemed sincere," he said finally. "But sincerity isn't enough. I need to know there's real change happening, something concrete." Trey leaned back, considering. "We could make that happen. Public pressure has a way of speeding things up." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And you think Helen will just vanish from the equation?" Trey laughed, a low, knowing chuckle. "Oh, she won't vanish. People like her rarely do. But she'll be exposed, and that's a start." Back in the bank, Helen was unraveling. Her polished composure had slipped, replaced by a simmering anger. She retreated to her office, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she landed on a familiar name, her brother, James. James was a corporate lawyer, someone Helen had relied on countless times to navigate tricky situations. He picked up after the second ring. "Helen, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady and professional. Helen wasted no time. "There's been an incident. A customer, Marcus Turner. He's accusing me of discrimination. And now Hayes is involved." James sighed, his tone shifting to one of cautious concern. "What exactly happened, Helen?" "I didn't do anything wrong," she snapped. "I was following protocol. But this man, he thinks he can just waltz in here and demand special treatment." James was silent for a moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped. "Helen, I need you to be honest with me. Did you say or do anything that could be construed as discriminatory? No, she said quickly, though her voice wavered slightly. I mean, not intentionally. James's sigh was heavier this time. Not intentionally isn't good enough. If this goes public, the bank will do whatever it takes to protect itself, even if that means throwing you under the bus. Helen's stomach turned. You're supposed to be on my side. I am, James said firmly. Which is why I'm telling you to tread carefully. Document everything. And for God's sake, don't say another word to anyone without legal counsel present. Meanwhile, Clara sat at her desk, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the image of Marcus's calm but resolute demeanor, or the subtle tension in Helen's voice as she dismissed Clara's concerns. Something about the whole situation gnawed at her. For too long, she'd kept her head down, avoiding confrontation. But Marcus's presence had stirred something in her, a quiet but insistent urge to do the right thing. After glancing around to ensure no one was watching, Clara pulled out her phone and began typing a message. It was addressed to Marcus. She'd taken a discreet photo of the bank's customer code of conduct earlier, highlighting the clauses about fair treatment and anti-discrimination policies. With trembling fingers, she attached the image and hit send. A few moments later, Marcus's phone buzzed. He read the message, his brow furrowing slightly. Clara's words were careful but clear. I thought you might find this useful. I'm sorry for what happened. If you need more information, I'm here. Interesting, Marcus murmured, showing the text to Trey. Looks like you've got an ally, Trey said, his grin widening. This could be leverage. Marcus shook his head. Not leverage. A way in. That evening, Helen sat alone in her modest suburban home, a glass of wine in hand. The day's events replayed in her mind on an endless loop. She couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she'd miscalculated. Hayes's intervention had shaken her, but what troubled her more was the quiet conviction in Marcus's eyes. He wasn't just another disgruntled customer. He was deliberate, calculating, dangerous in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Her phone buzzed, and she groaned, expecting another message from James. But it wasn't him. It was an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "A lesson in humility." Helen's heart raced as she opened the message. Inside was a single line of text, "The world is watching." Below it was a link to an online forum. She clicked it hesitantly, her breath catching as she scrolled through the thread. It was filled with first-hand accounts from other customers, all detailing similar experiences at the bank, most involving Helen. The thread was gaining traction, shared widely across social media platforms. Comments ranged from outrage to demands for accountability. Helen's name hadn't been mentioned directly, yet, but it was only a matter of time. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone, dialing Hayes's number. He answered on the second ring. "Helen," he said, his tone curt. "What is it?" "There's a situation online," she stammered. "People are spreading lies about the bank, and about me." Hayes was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was cold. "This is what happens when you lose sight of our values, Helen. I'll handle the fallout. But your position here is under review. Effective immediately." Helen's world tilted. She opened her mouth to protest, but the line had already gone dead. Marcus sat in his quiet study, staring at the email from Clara. He admired her courage but knew that speaking out wouldn't come without risk. He tapped out a reply, keeping it brief but encouraging. "Thank you for stepping up. Let's talk soon." As he hit send, his phone buzzed again, this time, a call from Trey. "Turner," Trey said, his voice brimming with excitement. "That forum thread is blowing up. People are coming out of the woodwork with stories about Helen and that bank." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good. Let's keep the pressure on." But deep down, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Helen wasn't the root of the problem, she was a symptom of a larger system that needed dismantling. And while today's victory felt significant, Marcus was already thinking about the battles ahead. The game had changed, and Marcus was ready to play. To be continued. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, but for Helen, the world felt unusually dark. Her coffee sat untouched on the kitchen counter, the bitter scent filling the air as she scrolled endlessly through her phone. News of the incident had spread faster than she could have imagined. A major local blog had picked up the story, drawing attention to the forum thread, and now her name was front and center. The headline read, "Bank Manager Faces Accusations of Discrimination Amid Viral Customer Accounts." Below it was a photo someone had taken of Helen during a community event months ago, smiling stiffly in front of a company banner. The irony of that carefully curated image being used against her now wasn't lost on her. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from supportive colleagues, others not so subtle warnings about the growing firestorm. A text from James caught her eye, "Call me immediately." She stared at it, her thumb hovering over the call button. But what was the point? James had made it clear she was on her own if things spiraled further. Meanwhile, Marcus and Trey were deep in conversation at a downtown cafe. The usually bustling space was quieter than normal, giving their words an almost conspiratorial tone. "The response has been bigger than I expected," Marcus admitted, scrolling through the online comments. "People are angry, but I'm not sure anger alone is enough." "It's not just anger, Marcus. It's momentum," Trey countered, leaning forward. "People are sick of this kind of behavior being swept under the rug. This is bigger than Helen now, it's about the entire institution. If we play this right, we could push for systemic change." Marcus sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Systemic change isn't easy, Trey. It's messy, and it takes time. And right now, Helen is the face of this mess. If we don't handle this carefully, it'll look like a personal vendetta." "And you're okay with that?" Trey asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Because I'm not," Marcus sighed. "I'm not okay with it. But I'm not going to let this derail into a spectacle. This isn't just about her, it's about setting a precedent. And that means being smart about how we move forward." Trey nodded, albeit reluctantly. "So, what's your plan?" "I've already reached out to some community leaders," Marcus said. "If we can get them on board, we'll have more leverage. This isn't just my fight. It's bigger than me, or Helen." At the bank, Hayes sat in his corner office, poring over reports and damage control strategies. His conversation with Helen the night before had left a sour taste in his mouth. She was capable and experienced, but her judgment had been questionable for years. Her recent actions had simply forced his hand. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a snapshot of his team from the annual retreat. Helen was there, standing stiffly near the back, her smile barely reaching her eyes. It was an image that now felt oddly prophetic, a symbol of the disconnect he'd been too blind to see before. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Clara peeked in, her expression hesitant. "Come in," Hayes said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. Clara closed the door behind her and sat down, clutching a small notebook. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened yesterday," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Hayes nodded, folding his hands on the desk. "I'm listening." Clara hesitated, glancing down at her notes. "I think it's important to address this openly. People are talking, staff, customers. And while some are defending Helen, many aren't. They've experienced similar treatment, and it's damaging the bank's reputation." Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Do you believe Helen acted out of bias?" Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think Helen sees herself as biased. But her actions, and the patterns I've noticed, suggest otherwise. It's not just Marcus. There's a history here." Hayes nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Thank you for your honesty, Clara. It's not easy to speak up about these things." Clara nodded, relief flickering across her face. "I just want to make sure the bank does the right thing." As Clara left the office, Hayes stared at the closed door, his thoughts churning. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't one he liked. That evening, Marcus received a call from someone unexpected. Pastor Evans, a well-respected figure in the community, had heard about the situation and wanted to meet. Marcus agreed, knowing that having someone like Pastor Evans on his side could lend credibility to his cause. They met at the pastor's modest office in the heart of the neighborhood. The room was warm and inviting, filled with books and photos of community events. "Marcus," Pastor Evans said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Pastor," Marcus replied, shaking his hand firmly. They sat down, and Pastor Evans wasted no time getting to the point. "I've been following what's happening at the bank. It's troubling, to say the least." Marcus nodded. "It's not just about me. This kind of behavior affects so many people." "I understand," the pastor said. "But I want to caution you. Anger is a powerful motivator, but it can also be destructive. If this situation escalates, it could divide the community rather than bring it together." Marcus frowned. "So, what do you suggest?" "Focus on the bigger picture," Pastor Evans said. "This is an opportunity to advocate for change, not just accountability. If you lead with integrity, people will follow." Marcus considered the pastor's words carefully. "I appreciate your advice, Pastor. I'll do my best to honor that." As Marcus left the office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Back at her home, Helen was spiraling. She'd spent the day combing through the forum thread, her chest tightening with every new story that surfaced. The posts painted a damning picture, one that even she couldn't deny. Her carefully constructed facade of professionalism was crumbling, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the possibility that she wasn't the victim in this story. But self-reflection was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The bank was clearly distancing itself from her, and Hayes's words from the night before still echoed in her mind. She needed to act, and fast. She opened her laptop, typing furiously as she drafted an email to Hayes. It was a desperate attempt to salvage her position, filled with excuses and half-hearted promises to do better. But as she stared at the screen, something stopped her. The words felt hollow, insincere. And deep down, she knew they wouldn't be enough. For the first time in her career, Helen felt powerless. And she hated it. As the city buzzed around them, the pieces of this complex puzzle were slowly falling into place. Marcus was gaining allies, Helen was grappling with her crumbling reputation. And Hayes was faced with a decision that could define his leadership. But the real question remained, would justice prevail, or would the weight of bureaucracy and personal biases tip the scales once again? The answers were just out of reach, but one thing was certain, the storm was far from over. To be continued? Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, the glow of his laptop casting long shadows on the walls. His inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others angry, and a few outright threatening. Despite his strong resolve, the weight of it all began to creep in. Just as he leaned back to stretch, a new email notification popped up. The subject line was intriguing, "I believe I can help." Curiosity piqued, Marcus clicked on it. The sender was anonymous, their address a string of random characters. The message was brief but precise, "I've seen what's happening. You're not wrong about the bank's systemic issues. I used to work there, and I know where the bodies are buried. If you're serious about change, meet me tomorrow night at the cafe on West Main. Come alone." Marcus reread the email several times, his mind racing. Who was this person? Could they be trusted? It felt risky, but if there was a chance they had real information, it might be worth the gamble. At the same time, Helen sat at her dining table with a glass of wine, staring at a printed list of client names and accounts. Her desperation had taken a sharp turn into scheming. She knew the bank wouldn't protect her if this situation escalated further, so she needed leverage, something to force Hayes to reconsider throwing her under the bus. The list in front of her was a catalog of the bank's highest-profile clients, many of whom had, let's say, unconventional approaches to taxes and investments. Over her years in management, Helen had learned plenty about these clients' financial dealings, some of which veered dangerously close to illegal. She'd never acted on this knowledge before, keeping it as her own insurance policy, but now seemed like the time to cash in. As Helen debated her next move, her phone buzzed with a call. It was James. She let it ring twice before picking up, her voice tight. "What?" "Thought you'd want to know," James began, his tone clipped. "Hayes' meeting with the regional director tomorrow. Your name's going to come up." Helen's stomach dropped. And nothing good. "Look, Helen, I tried to warn you. This isn't just about Marcus anymore. There are others stepping forward. Employees, clients. Hayes won't have a choice but to act." Helen gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening. "I've given this bank years of my life. He can't just, he can, and he will," James interrupted. "You're toxic right now. If I were you, I'd start thinking about an exit strategy." The line went dead before Helen could respond. She stared at the phone, her pulse racing. If the bank was willing to let her fall, maybe it was time to let them burn with her. The following evening, Marcus arrived at the cafe on West Main. It was dimly lit and almost empty, the faint hum of soft jazz playing in the background. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on a woman sitting in the back corner, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "You're punctual," she said as he approached, gesturing to the seat across from her. Marcus hesitated before sitting. "And you are?" "Call me Erica," she replied, offering a faint smile. "I used to work in the compliance department at the bank. That is, until I realized my job wasn't about enforcing rules, it was about covering things up." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "What kind of things?" Erica leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Shady loans, predatory practices, discriminatory policies. You name it. The bank has been sweeping it under the rug for years. Helen's just a symptom of a much larger disease. Why come forward now?" Marcus asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. "What's in it for you?" Erica sighed, her expression softening. "Because I'm tired of staying silent. When I saw your story gaining traction, I knew this was the moment to step up. You have a platform, Marcus. People are listening to you. If we work together, we can expose everything." Marcus studied her carefully, trying to gauge her sincerity. "And how do I know you're not just trying to use me for your own agenda?" Erica smirked. "You don't. But if you want to take down the system that protected Helen and countless others like her, you'll need me." Meanwhile, Helen was making moves of her own. She spent the day compiling a dossier of sensitive information about the bank's top clients and executives. By evening, she had a USB drive full of incriminating evidence that could tank not just her career but the institution itself. As she stared at the drive, her phone buzzed with another message from James. "Last chance to do the right thing, Helen." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. The right thing was a concept she'd abandoned long ago. In this game, survival trumped morality. And if Hayes thought she'd go quietly, he had another thing coming. Back at the cafe, Erica slid a folder across the table to Marcus. Inside were documents, emails, internal memos, and whistleblower complaints, all pointing to a deeply entrenched culture of malpractice at the bank. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Erica said. "If you're serious about exposing this, we'll need to gather more evidence and bring in allies. Media, lawyers, activists. It's going to get messy." Marcus's mind raced as he flipped through the pages. "Messy doesn't scare me," he said finally. "But I need to know you're not going to bail when things get tough." Erica met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I've already lost everything once. I'm not afraid to do it again." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a spark of hope. He didn't know if Erica could be trusted completely, but her information was too valuable to ignore. Together, they might just have a shot at dismantling the system that had allowed people like Helen to thrive. Unbeknownst to either of them, Helen was already a step ahead. She had scheduled a meeting with an investigative journalist, ready to spill everything she knew, not out of altruism, but as a calculated move to shift the narrative. If she couldn't control the fallout, she'd at least make sure she wasn't the only one caught in the storm. As the journalist leaned forward, recorder in hand, Helen began her story, her voice calm but laced with venom. "This bank has been rotten from the inside out for years. And I'm about to tell you exactly why." The stage was set. Marcus and Erica were building their case, Helen was playing a dangerous game of retaliation, and Hayes was bracing for the inevitable. The city buzzed with whispers of what might come next, but one thing was clear, the reckoning was just beginning. To be continued? The buzz in the city grew louder over the next few days. Marcus's story had gained momentum, with media outlets picking it up and community groups rallying around him. Public pressure mounted on the bank, forcing Hayes to issue a carefully worded statement promising an internal review. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Hayes knew he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. The exposure of the bank's practices was no longer a hypothetical threat, it was imminent. Marcus and Erica worked tirelessly, poring over the documents she'd provided and connecting the dots to form a clear, damning picture of the bank's corruption. They built alliances with civil rights attorneys, grassroots organizations, and investigative journalists. Marcus found himself thrust into a leadership role he hadn't anticipated, but he embraced it, fueled by a sense of justice and a growing understanding of the systemic issues at play. Erica proved to be an invaluable ally. Her knowledge of the bank's inner workings allowed them to navigate its labyrinth of policies and practices with precision. Yet, Marcus couldn't shake a lingering doubt about her motives. Why now? Why him? Still, the evidence she provided was irrefutable, and for the moment, they needed each other. Meanwhile, Helen was waging her own battle. The dossier she handed to the journalist had sparked a flurry of activity, with headlines beginning to hint at financial improprieties within the bank. But Helen's gambit was not without risk. The bank's legal team had already contacted her, warning of severe consequences if she continued her crusade. In a rare moment of introspection, Helen sat alone in her office, staring at a photograph of her younger self on her first day at the bank. She had once been bright-eyed and hopeful, believing she could climb the corporate ladder with integrity. Somewhere along the way, ambition had clouded her judgment, leading her to compromise her values time and again. Now, facing the potential ruin of her career, Helen found herself wondering if it had all been worth it. The turning point came during a live-stream town hall event organized by a local advocacy group. Marcus was the keynote speaker, and the room buzzed with anticipation. As he stepped onto the stage, he took a moment to survey the crowd, Faces of all ages, races, and backgrounds, united in their demand for accountability. "I stand here today not as a victim, but as a voice," Marcus began, his voice steady but passionate. "A voice for everyone who has been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated by a system that prioritizes profit over people. This isn't just my story, it's our story." The audience erupted in applause, but before Marcus could continue, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Helen walked in, flanked by reporters and carrying a stack of documents. The room fell silent as she approached the stage. Marcus froze, unsure of her intentions. Helen climbed the steps and took the microphone, her expression unreadable. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm, "I owe you an apology. And I owe this community the truth." The crowd murmured in confusion. Marcus stepped aside, allowing Helen to address the audience. Over the next 10 minutes, she laid bare the bank's darkest secrets, predatory lending practices, racial discrimination, and a systematic effort to silence whistleblowers. She named names, cited dates, and provided concrete evidence, much of which corroborated the information Erica had already uncovered. By the time she finished, the audience was in stunned silence. Helen turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," she said, "but I can help make things right." The fallout was immediate and dramatic. The bank's executives scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. Federal investigations were launched. Lawsuits were filed, and several high-ranking officials resigned under pressure. Hayes, the man who had tried to protect the institution at all costs, was among the first to go. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. While he had succeeded in exposing the corruption, the fight had taken a toll on him emotionally and physically. Still, he found solace in the knowledge that his efforts had sparked meaningful change. Erica, too, emerged from the ordeal with a renewed sense of purpose. She took on a leadership role in a non-profit organization dedicated to financial reform, using her insider knowledge to advocate for systemic change. As for Helen, her decision to come forward marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She faced legal repercussions for her role in the bank's practices, but her cooperation earned her leniency. More importantly, it allowed her to begin the process of redemption. In a final twist, Marcus received an anonymous package in the mail a few weeks later. Inside was a note that read, "For your next fight." Attached to the note was a USB drive containing even more incriminating evidence, not just against the bank, but against several other major financial institutions. Marcus stared at the drive, a mix of exhaustion and resolve washing over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt ready to take it on. The screen fades to black as Marcus's voice narrates, "Sometimes, change doesn't come from the top down. It starts with one person, one voice, and a refusal to back down. Together, we can rewrite the rules." To be continued. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the USB drive resting between his fingers as if it were a weight too heavy to hold. The note's words echoed in his mind, "For your next fight." He wasn't sure if he had the strength to dive back into another battle so soon. The revelations about the bank had consumed his life, and while the fight had yielded results, it had also exposed the toll such battles took on a person's spirit. Yet, he couldn't ignore what he held in his hands. The people behind this evidence believed in him, and the movement he had inadvertently started. He placed the drive aside for the moment. There were other loose threads to tie up first. The next week, Marcus received a surprise visitor at the community center where he'd been volunteering. Helen walked in, dressed down from her usual polished attire, looking almost unrecognizable. Marcus was caught off guard but motioned for her to sit across from him. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard. "And to explain." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Explain what, exactly?" Helen sighed. "Everything. I've spent years in a system that rewards silence and punishes anyone who tries to challenge it. I convinced myself I was doing what I had to survive. But watching you stand up and refuse to let them win, it reminded me of who I used to be, before I lost my way." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. He could hear the sincerity in her words, but forgiveness didn't come easy. "So, what now? You've done your part to expose the bank. Are you ready to face the consequences?" "I already am," she replied. "I've been cooperating with federal investigators. I'm sharing everything I know about the bank's practices and the people behind them. I don't expect anyone to see me as a hero, but I want to be part of the solution, even if it's just a small part." Marcus nodded slowly. "It's a start." Before she left, Helen handed him a folded piece of paper. "This is the contact information for a journalist I worked with. She has connections with investigative teams across the country. If you decide to take on whatever's on that USB drive, she can help. Meanwhile, Erica had taken the evidence from their initial case and transformed it into a campaign for systemic financial reform. She partnered with activists and legislators to push for stricter oversight of banking practices. Marcus and Erica remained in close contact, often strategizing late into the night. Their shared experiences had forged a bond of trust, and together, they were becoming a formidable force for change. One evening, as they reviewed potential whistleblowers who had reached out since the bank scandal broke, Marcus finally brought up the USB drive. "There's more," he said, sliding it across the table to Erica. "This came to me anonymously. I haven't looked at it yet, but I have a feeling it's big." Erica picked up the drive, turning it over in her hand. "Do we want to open this door? We've already stirred up a lot of powerful enemies." Marcus met her gaze. "We have to. If there's more corruption out there, we can't ignore it." The contents of the drive were more explosive than either of them could have anticipated. It contained evidence of widespread fraud and discrimination not just within the banking industry but in other major sectors, including housing and healthcare. The scope was overwhelming, but it also presented an opportunity to tackle systemic injustices on a larger scale. They knew they couldn't do it alone. Marcus reached out to the journalist Helen had recommended, a seasoned investigator named Naomi Grant. Naomi was skeptical at first, having seen countless whistleblowers promise groundbreaking stories that fizzled under scrutiny. But when Marcus and Erica laid out the evidence, her skepticism turned to astonishment. "This is a goldmine," Naomi said, her voice tinged with urgency. "But it's also dangerous. If you go public with this, the backlash will be 10 times worse than what you've faced so far." Marcus nodded. "We're ready for that." Naomi's team got to work, cross-referencing the evidence and building a comprehensive exposé. The process took weeks, during which Marcus and Erica continued to rally public support and keep the momentum of their movement alive. They organized town halls, appeared on talk shows, and collaborated with community leaders to amplify their message. As the day of the exposé's release approached, Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. He knew this story would shake the foundations of several industries, but he also knew it would make him and everyone involved targets. Still, he reminded himself of the people who had reached out to him, those who had suffered under these systems and were counting on him to fight for change. On the morning of the release, Naomi's article went live. Titled, "The Hidden Cost of Corruption, How America's Systems Are Rigged Against Its People," it painted a damning picture of institutionalized injustice. The article quickly went viral, sparking outrage and calls for action across the country. For Marcus, the response was overwhelming. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support, interview requests, and, predictably, threats. But what struck him most were the messages from ordinary people sharing their stories, of being denied loans, losing homes, or being overcharged for healthcare. These messages reminded him why he had started this fight in the first place. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the exposé was unprecedented. Several CEOs resigned, federal investigations were launched, and new legislation aimed at curbing corporate corruption began making its way through Congress. Marcus became a reluctant public figure, his face appearing on magazine covers and news segments as a symbol of grassroots activism. But despite the victories, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The systems they were challenging were deeply entrenched, and real change would take time. He leaned on his growing network of allies, including Erica, Naomi, and even Helen, who continued to provide insider knowledge to help their cause. One evening, as Marcus prepared for another town hall, he received a package in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for being brave enough to do what so many of us couldn't. You've given us hope. Keep fighting." Beneath the note was a small medallion engraved with the word justice. Marcus held it in his hand, feeling a surge of gratitude. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it. He was reminded that change didn't come from one person alone, it was the result of countless voices coming together, refusing to be silenced. As Marcus stepped onto the stage that night, he looked out at the crowd and smiled. The fight wasn't over, but together, they were unstoppable. "Let's keep pushing," he began. "Because the only way to create a better world is to believe we can, and then act on it." The screen fades to black as the words "Change Starts With Us" appear, leaving viewers inspired and ready to join the movement. The end. The park buzzed with the sound of children laughing, the rhythmic creak of swings, and the chatter of parents enjoying the crisp fall afternoon. Amid the colorful chaos, 10-year-old Maya giggled as she raced around the playground, her curly hair bouncing with every step. She was there with her mother, Lisa, who sat nearby on a bench, keeping a watchful eye while scrolling through emails on her phone. Maya was a regular at the park, and her bright energy often made her the centerpiece of games with other kids. But today, something felt different. It started subtly, a lingering stare. Karen Thompson, a middle-aged woman known among the neighborhood for her sharp tongue and quick temper, stood off to the side, clutching a small dog on a rhinestone leash. Karen's pale face was pulled into a frown as she watched Maya play. At first, it seemed innocent enough, an adult keeping an eye on the children. But her gaze didn't soften, it hardened. Her lips moved slightly as if she was muttering to herself, and she began pacing, her boots crunching against the gravel. Lisa noticed Karen's behavior but brushed it off. Maybe she was having a bad day, Lisa thought. Or maybe she was just one of those people who had trouble relaxing in public spaces. Whatever it was, Lisa wasn't going to let it ruin their afternoon. She turned her attention back to her emails, determined to finish up before she and Maya headed home for dinner. But then, the tension escalated. Karen marched closer to the playground and shouted, "Whose kid is this?" The question hung in the air, silencing the laughter and halting the games. Children paused mid-swing, and parents turned their heads. Maya froze, her smile fading as Karen's accusing eyes locked onto her. Lisa stood up immediately, her instincts as both a mother and a leader kicking in. She walked toward Karen, her heels clicking with quiet authority. "She's my daughter," Lisa said, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" Karen scoffed, looking Lisa up and down as if sizing her up. "Yeah, there's a problem," she snapped. "Your daughter's been bothering the other kids and acting like she owns the place. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior around here." Lisa blinked, stunned by the accusation. Maya was one of the kindest, most respectful kids she knew. "I think you're mistaken," Lisa said evenly. "Maya hasn't done anything wrong." Karen's face twisted in frustration. "Oh, so now you're calling me a liar?" she said, her voice rising. "I saw her pushing other kids and running wild. This is a public park, not a jungle gym for people who don't know how to behave." The air grew thick with tension. Other parents whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Maya stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Lisa took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let this escalate. Not here, not in front of Maya. "I don't appreciate your tone," Lisa said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. "If you have a specific concern, you can address it respectfully. Otherwise, I suggest we move on and enjoy the park." But Karen wasn't backing down. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this before. "Fine," she said. "If you won't handle it, I will. I'm calling the police." A collective gasp rippled through the park. Some parents stepped closer to their children, while others reached for their phones, ready to record. Lisa felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure. This wasn't the first time she'd dealt with a difficult situation, and she knew the importance of staying calm under pressure. Karen held the phone to her ear, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at the park," she said, her eyes flicking to Lisa and Maya. "There's a child here causing trouble, and her mother is being aggressive. I think they might be dangerous." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to Karen, her posture radiating calm authority. "Karen," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "you might want to reconsider your actions. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. "Oh, really? And why is that?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Lisa took a moment, letting the weight of her words hang in the air before she spoke. "Because," she said, her tone steady and deliberate, "I'm the mayor of this town." The words landed like a thunderclap, silencing even the faintest whisper. Karen's smirk faltered, her eyes widening as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. She glanced around, suddenly aware of the growing crowd and the phones pointed in her direction. The color drained from her face, but she didn't lower the phone. It was as if she were frozen, caught between disbelief and defiance. Maya, sensing the shift in energy, moved closer to her mother, slipping her small hand into Lisa's. Lisa gave it a reassuring squeeze, her focus never wavering from Karen. For a moment, it felt as if time stood still, the world holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Karen double down, fueled by embarrassment and anger? Or would she backpedal, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left? The answer remained unclear, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And as the first faint sound of sirens reached the park, the crowd edged closer, eager to witness the story's next chapter. Karen's lips parted, as if to argue, but no words came out. Her mouth worked silently for a moment, her face a vivid portrait of disbelief and confusion. "The mayor?" she finally stammered, her voice lower but still tinged with skepticism. "Yes," Lisa replied, her tone unwavering. "Lisa Monroe. I was elected last year. You may have seen me on the news or at community events." She let the words sink in, keeping her expression neutral, though her heart was pounding. Lisa hated pulling rank, but protecting Maya and shutting down this woman's baseless aggression was non-negotiable. Around them, murmurs broke out in the crowd. Some parents whispered to one another, their phones still held aloft to capture every second of the unfolding drama. Maya, clutching her mother's hand tightly, looked up at Lisa, her dark eyes full of questions. "Mommy, what's going to happen?" she asked in a soft voice. Lisa leaned down slightly, her features softening for her daughter. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Stay close to me." Karen seemed to be grappling with her next move, her grip on her phone tightening. I don't care if you're the mayor," she blurted, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't get special treatment. If your kid is out of control, someone needs to do something about it." Lisa didn't flinch. "Maya isn't out of control," she said calmly. "She's playing, just like every other child here. If you have a specific issue, I'd be happy to address it. Otherwise, I suggest you hang up that phone and stop wasting everyone's time." Karen's eyes darted toward the gathering crowd. It was clear she was losing her grip on the situation, but pride and indignation held her back. "This isn't about wasting time," she said, her voice rising again. "It's about keeping the park safe." And, the wail of approaching sirens cut her off. The crowd turned toward the street as a police car rolled up, lights flashing but siren off now. Two officers stepped out, their faces calm but alert as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, addressed Karen directly. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what's going on?" Karen stepped forward eagerly, her voice a mix of relief and urgency. "Thank goodness you're here. That woman," she said, jabbing a finger in Lisa's direction, "and her daughter are causing trouble. The kid's been bullying others, and when I tried to address it, the mother got aggressive with me." The officer glanced at Lisa, who stood still and composed, her hand still resting protectively on Maya's shoulder. "Is that true, ma'am?" he asked. Lisa met his gaze evenly. "No, officer, it's not. My daughter was playing peacefully with the other children when this woman began accusing her of misbehavior. When I tried to address her concerns calmly, she escalated the situation and called you." The officer nodded, his expression neutral as he turned to the crowd. "Did anyone here witness what happened?" he asked. A young mother with a toddler on her hip stepped forward. "I was sitting nearby," she said, her voice steady. "Maya wasn't doing anything wrong. She was playing tag with some other kids." Karen started yelling at her out of nowhere. A man with a baseball cap chimed in. "Yeah, I saw the whole thing. This lady," he said, pointing at Karen, "was being way out of line. The girl didn't do anything." The officers exchanged a glance before turning back to Karen. Her face flushed red as she looked around, realizing the tide of public opinion had fully turned against her. "I was just trying to keep things safe," she muttered, her voice losing its earlier bravado. The taller officer sighed and addressed her firmly. "Ma'am, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. No laws have been broken, and there's no evidence of any disturbance caused by this child or her mother. We suggest you let this go and move on." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she clamped her jaw shut and turned away, muttering under her breath. The other officer approached Lisa, his expression softening. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am," he said. "We'll make a note of what happened, but there's nothing more to worry about." Lisa nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, officers," she said. "I appreciate your professionalism." She crouched down to Maya's level, brushing a curl away from her daughter's face. "Are you okay, honey?" Maya nodded slowly, though her eyes still held traces of fear and confusion. "Why was she so mean, Mommy?" she asked in a small voice. Lisa's heart ached at the question. "Sometimes people don't understand others who are different from them," she said gently. "And sometimes they let their fear or anger get the better of them. But you did nothing wrong, Maya. Remember that." As the officers returned to their car and the crowd began to disperse, Karen lingered at the edge of the playground, her face a mask of simmering frustration. Lisa noticed her but chose to focus on Maya, leading her back to the swings. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's anger wasn't entirely spent. That evening, after tucking Maya into bed and reassuring her that the world was full of far more kindness than hostility, Lisa sat down with her laptop. She typed out a measured post for the town's community page, addressing the incident. Her words were careful yet pointed, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with respect and standing against baseless accusations. She didn't name Karen directly, but the message was clear. By morning, the post had gone viral within the town. Comments flooded in, most of them supportive, praising Lisa for her grace and leadership. A few, however, echoed Karen's sentiments, suggesting that Lisa was overreacting or using her position for sympathy. Lisa read each comment carefully, her resolve strengthening. The incident at the park wasn't just about her or Maya, it was a reflection of deeper issues in the community, ones she was determined to address. Meanwhile, Karen watched from the sidelines, scrolling through the comments with a mix of anger and humiliation. Her face burned as she realized just how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. But as much as she wanted to let it go, something inside her refused to back down. She began drafting her own post, one she hoped would turn the tide in her favor. Lisa, however, was ready for whatever came next. She knew this wasn't just about a single confrontation in the park. It was about setting an example for Maya and the community she served. And she wasn't about to let fear or intimidation win. Karen's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing with how to craft her response. She couldn't believe the humiliation she'd endured, and now the whole town seemed to be rallying behind Lisa Monroe, the perfect mayor. The very thought made Karen's stomach churn. It wasn't just about the park anymore, it was about principle. Or so she told herself. She typed furiously, her words laced with justification. I spoke up because I care about our community. While others stood by, I took action to maintain order. Now I'm being vilified for doing the right thing? She hit post and sat back, her heart hammering. Within minutes, notifications flooded her phone. Some people agreed, their comments filled with words like brave and misunderstood. Others were less kind, accusing her of being a bully and questioning her intentions. The digital battlefield only stoked Karen's resentment. She wasn't going to let Lisa have the last word. Not this time. Meanwhile, Lisa woke up to an inbox overflowing with messages. Most were from friends and constituents offering support. But a few were angry, accusing her of playing the race card or using her position to avoid accountability. She sighed, closing her laptop and heading to the kitchen. Maya sat at the table, her face lit up as she colored a picture of a sunny park, complete with happy children playing. Lisa smiled softly. If only reality mirrored Maya's innocent view of the world. "Mommy, are we going to the park today?" Maya asked, holding up her drawing. Lisa hesitated. She didn't want to discourage her daughter, but the idea of running into Karen or anyone else ready to stir up trouble made her uneasy. "Maybe later," she said gently. "Let's have a quiet morning first." By midday, Karen's post had reached Lisa, forwarded by a concerned friend. The tone was defensive and accusatory, painting Karen as the victim of an unfair smear campaign. Lisa groaned, rubbing her temples. She didn't want this to spiral further, but ignoring it could allow Karen's version of events to gain traction. As a mayor, she had to be mindful of public perception, but as a mother, her first priority was protecting Maya. Striking that balance felt impossible. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sam, her chief of staff. "We need to talk. PR issue brewing." Lisa stepped into her home office and called Sam. "What's the damage?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Karen's post is getting attention, but the town's still mostly on your side," Sam replied. "Still, a few local groups are calling for a formal apology. They're framing it as a conflict of interest, using your position to intimidate someone." Lisa's jaw tightened. "Intimidate? I didn't even raise my voice." "I know, but perception is everything," Sam said. "I think it's time to address this head-on. Maybe hold a press conference, reaffirm your commitment to inclusivity, and highlight your track record." Lisa exhaled slowly. "Fine. Let's set it up for tomorrow morning." As she hung up, Maya peeked into the office. "Mommy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Lisa knelt down, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just working on grown-up stuff. You don't need to worry about a thing." But Maya wasn't convinced. She'd seen the way her mother's face tensed and how people in the park had stared at her like she'd done something wrong. "Is it because of the lady from the park?" she whispered. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, But it's nothing we can't handle. Remember, when people don't understand something, they can act in ways that aren't kind. That doesn't mean we stop being kind ourselves." Maya nodded, though a flicker of sadness lingered in her eyes. Karen wasn't done stirring the pot. She reached out to a local tabloid-style blog, one known for sensationalizing small-town drama. The writer, eager for clicks, latched onto Karen's story. By evening, an article appeared with the headline, "Mayor Monroe accused of misusing authority in playground dispute." It was filled with Karen's side of the story, portraying her as a concerned citizen who was unfairly targeted by a powerful official. Lisa's phone rang almost immediately. It was Sam again. "We have a problem," he said grimly. "I saw it," Lisa said, pacing her living room. "This is ridiculous. They're twisting everything." Sam's voice softened. "I know. But this is bigger than just Karen now. The story's out there, and people are choosing sides." Lisa clenched her fists. She had spent her career building a reputation for fairness and integrity. Watching it come under attack because of one petty individual was infuriating. But she knew anger wouldn't solve anything. "I'll address it at the press conference," she said. "We stick to the facts." That night, Maya lay in bed, her mind racing. She had overheard parts of her mother's conversation and pieced together more than Lisa realized. She thought about Karen's angry face, the way she had looked at Maya like she didn't belong. Maya didn't understand why, but she knew it wasn't fair. Gripping her stuffed bear tightly, she made a silent vow: she wouldn't let people like Karen stop her from being happy. The next morning, the town square buzzed with reporters, residents, and a few protesters holding signs, some in support of Lisa, others accusing her of overreach. Lisa stood behind a podium, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I'd like to address the events that have been discussed so widely over the past few days. As mayor, my responsibility is to serve this community with fairness and integrity. As a mother, my responsibility is to protect my daughter. These roles are not in conflict, they're intertwined." She went on to recount the incident, sticking to the facts while emphasizing the importance of creating safe spaces for everyone in the community. "This isn't about me or even the individual involved. It's about the kind of town we want to be, a place where kindness and understanding prevail over fear and division." The crowd reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Karen, watching from a distance, folded her arms tightly. She didn't expect Lisa to handle it so gracefully, and it left her feeling unsteady, unsure of her next move. As Lisa stepped away from the podium, she caught sight of Maya in the front row, sitting next to Sam. Maya gave her a big thumbs up, and Lisa felt a wave of warmth wash over her. But even as she smiled back, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen's expression darkened as she turned and walked away, her mind racing with plans. If Lisa wanted a battle for the soul of the community, Karen thought bitterly, she'd give her one. As Lisa stepped off the stage, a mix of relief and exhaustion washed over her. The press conference had gone well, better than she'd hoped, but she knew this wasn't the end. The tension in the crowd lingered, a reminder that some battles weren't won with speeches alone. She made her way through the gathering, shaking hands with supporters and exchanging pleasantries, all the while keeping a protective eye on Maya, who clung to Sam's side. "Great job up there," Sam said when she reached them. He glanced at Maya, who smiled up at him with innocent pride. "You nailed the tone, empathetic, firm, and above the noise." "Thanks," Lisa said, her voice low. "But Karen's not going to let this drop. She thrives on conflict." Sam frowned, lowering his voice. "She's been working the sidelines. I heard she's trying to rally some of the Hoa groups, claiming you're divisive." "It's a small faction, but vocal," Lisa sighed. "Of course she is. Do you want me to dig deeper?" Sam offered. His voice carried a seriousness that underscored how high the stakes had become. "No," Lisa said after a pause. "Not yet. Let's not feed the fire unless we have to." She squeezed Maya's hand. "Right now, I just want to go home." But Karen wasn't going home. Across the square, she hovered on the periphery, blending in just enough to avoid notice while keeping Lisa in her sights. Her chest burned with frustration as she watched the mayor laugh softly with her daughter, surrounded by supporters. Karen had thought she could control the narrative, but it was slipping away. She'd underestimated Lisa, and now, with the press and public leaning in her favor, Karen felt cornered. But Karen Thompson didn't back down. She doubled down. As Lisa and Maya left the square, Karen's phone buzzed. It was a message from Linda, the editor of the local blog that had run her side of the story. The text was short but promising: "Got a lead you'll want to see. Meet me tonight. Karen's lips curled into a thin smile. If she couldn't win over the public with her version of events, maybe she could tip the scales another way. At home, Lisa tried to settle into her usual routine, but the day's events buzzed in her mind. She set Maya up with her favorite movie in the living room and retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner, hoping the rhythmic task would calm her nerves. But her phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter, texts, emails, social media notifications. The world wasn't ready to let this story go. Her mother's name popped up on the screen. Lisa hesitated, then answered. "Hi, Mom." "Lisa," her mother said in that tone, a mix of pride and worry that Lisa had heard her whole life. "I saw your press conference. You handled yourself beautifully." "Thanks," Lisa said, pouring herself a glass of water. "I just hope it's enough." There was a pause. "Karen Thompson's not your real problem," her mother said carefully. "It's the people who see her as a mouthpiece for something bigger. This is about more than a park incident." Lisa leaned against the counter, letting her mother's words sink in. She knew they were true. Karen was just a spark in a dry forest. The underlying tensions, about race, class, and power, were what truly fed the flames. "I know," Lisa said finally. "But I can't fight everything at once." "You don't have to," her mother replied. "Just stay true to who you are. The rest will follow." Lisa nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "Thanks, Mom. I'll try." After they hung up, Lisa returned to the living room to find Maya fast asleep, her little body curled up on the couch. Lisa sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "You're stronger than you know, kiddo," she whispered. "And so am I." Later that night, Karen met Linda at a dimly lit diner on the edge of town. The editor leaned across the table, her face illuminated by the glow of her tablet. "I've been digging," Linda said, her voice low. "And I found something interesting." Karen leaned closer, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "It's about Lisa," Linda said, pulling up a document. "Before she moved here, she was part of a pretty messy scandal in another city. Something about funding mismanagement during her time as deputy mayor. It didn't stick, she wasn't officially implicated, but there's enough smoke to suggest fire." Karen's eyes narrowed as she scanned the screen. "Why hasn't anyone brought this up before?" "She's good at keeping her slate clean," Linda said. "But if this gets out, it could raise questions about her credibility." Karen smirked, a slow, calculating expression. "And you're willing to run this?" Linda shrugged. "If you want to leak it, I'll publish it. But you should know, this kind of thing can backfire if people think you're just digging up dirt." Karen didn't hesitate. "Do it," she said. "The people deserve to know who their mayor really is." By morning, the article was live, its headline bold and provocative, "Mayor Monroe's Shady Past, What She Doesn't Want You to Know." The town buzzed with speculation, the story spreading like wildfire through social media and neighborhood groups. Lisa found out from Sam, who called her as she was driving Maya to school. "It's bad," he said, his tone grim. "They're dredging up that old investigation." Lisa's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "That was years ago," she said through clenched teeth. "I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "I know," Sam said. "But Karen's playing dirty, and some people are going to buy into it." Maya, sensing her mother's tension, looked up from the book she was reading in the backseat. "Mommy, are you okay?" Lisa forced a smile into her voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just work stuff." As she dropped Maya off and watched her skip toward the school building, Lisa felt a surge of resolve. Karen was pushing boundaries now, and Lisa couldn't afford to sit back. She needed to take control of the narrative before the damage became irreversible. But Karen wasn't just playing a game anymore. For her, this was personal, and she was determined to win, no matter the cost. The air in Lisa's office felt heavy as she sat with Sam the next morning, reviewing the fallout from the article. The town's online chatter had erupted, with the usual polarization, staunch supporters defending Lisa, skeptics questioning her past, and Karen's emboldened crowd seizing the moment to amplify the smear campaign. The pressure was mounting, but Lisa refused to let it break her. Sam placed a folder on her desk. "This might help," he said, his voice measured. "I've been digging into Karen's history. Turns out, she's got some skeletons of her own." Lisa raised an eyebrow, her fingers hesitating over the folder. "I'm not interested in playing dirty," she said firmly. "This isn't a mudslinging contest." "It's not about stooping to her level," Sam replied. "It's about being prepared. If she's going to throw rocks, you need to know where they're coming from." Reluctantly, Lisa opened the folder. Inside was a collection of records. HOA complaints, fines for code violations, and, most intriguingly, a lawsuit filed years ago by a former neighbor. The details painted a picture of someone who had a history of manipulating situations to her advantage. This lawsuit, Lisa said, flipping through the pages. It claims she falsified harassment reports to force someone out of their property. Sam nodded. Exactly. The case was settled out of court, but it's a pattern. She stirs up trouble and hides behind a facade of concern. Lisa closed the folder with a sigh. Even if this is useful, it doesn't solve the immediate problem. That article has people questioning my integrity. Sam leaned back in his chair. Then maybe it's time to shift the narrative. Show the town who you really are, outside the office, outside politics. Remind them why they voted for you in the first place. Lisa considered his words, her mind racing. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "This is Lisa Monroe." A warm, steady voice came through the line. "Mayor Monroe, this is Reverend Harris from St. Luke's. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Lisa's brow furrowed. She knew of Reverend Harris, a respected figure in the community, known for his quiet but impactful work. "Not at all, Reverend. What can I do for you?" "I've been following what's happening," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "And I'd like to offer my help. If you're willing, I think we can work together to turn this around." Lisa sat up straighter. "How so?" "There's a community event at the church tomorrow," Harris explained. "A chance for you to speak directly to the people, no media, no politics, just neighbors talking to neighbors. I think it could be a powerful way to cut through the noise." Lisa felt a flicker of hope. "That's a kind offer, Reverend. But you know this isn't just about me. There are deeper issues at play." "I do," Harris said. "Which is why we need to address them head-on." "Let's show the town what unity looks like," Lisa agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as she ended the call. She turned to Sam. "Looks like we have a new plan." Meanwhile, Karen was busy meeting with Linda again, her confidence bolstered by the article's traction. They huddled in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, strategizing their next move. "We need to keep the pressure on," Karen said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "The more questions people have about her, the less they'll trust her." Linda nodded but hesitated. "There's something else you should know. I got a tip that Reverend Harris has invited Lisa to speak at a community event. If she handles it well, it could shift the tide back in her favor." Karen's jaw tightened. "Harris? Of course, he'd side with her. He's always preaching about unity and second chances." Linda leaned closer. "If you want to stop this, you'll need to counter it. Make her look insincere. Maybe even challenge her directly." Karen smirked, her mind already churning with possibilities. "Let her talk. I'll be there to make sure everyone sees through her act." The next evening, the church was bustling with activity. Long tables were set up in the community hall, laden with potluck dishes brought by residents. The air buzzed with a mix of curiosity and tension as people trickled in, some eager to hear Lisa, others skeptical of her motives. Lisa arrived with Maya, whose presence immediately softened the atmosphere. Reverend Harris greeted them warmly, his presence radiating calm. "Thank you for coming, Mayor Monroe," he said, shaking her hand. He knelt to Maya's level, offering her a kind smile. "And hello, young lady. I'm glad you're here too." Maya smiled shyly, clutching Lisa's hand as they made their way to their seats. Karen entered moments later, keeping to the edges of the crowd. She scanned the room, her sharp gaze landing on Lisa. She resisted the urge to confront her immediately, choosing instead to bide her time. The event began with Harris addressing the crowd, his deep voice commanding attention. "We're here tonight as a community," he said. "To listen, to share, and to find common ground. This isn't about sides, it's about solutions." When it was Lisa's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure how they would receive her, but she knew she had to try. "I moved here to build a life for my daughter," she began, her voice steady. "To contribute to a community that values kindness and fairness. I've made mistakes, and I'm not perfect. But I believe in this town. And I believe we can do better, together." The room was quiet as she spoke, her words resonating with many in the audience. Karen, however, saw her opportunity. She raised her hand, cutting through the silence. "If you're so committed to fairness, Mayor Monroe, why not address the allegations in the article? The ones you haven't denied." A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. Lisa met Karen's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I've already addressed those allegations publicly, and I'll do so again now. There was no wrongdoing on my part, and I was cleared of any involvement. But this isn't about the past. It's about what we do moving forward." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Reverend Harris stepped in. "This isn't a debate," he said firmly. "It's a conversation. Let's focus on solutions, not accusations." The tension in the room was palpable, but Lisa's composure didn't falter. She turned back to the crowd, her voice steady. "I want to hear from you. What are your concerns? How can I serve you better?" One by one, residents began to speak, their voices blending into a tapestry of hope, frustration, and determination. Karen, standing on the sidelines, felt her grip on the narrative slipping. But she wasn't done, not yet. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the community hall shifted. The tension that had hung thick in the air began to dissipate, replaced by an earnest, if fragile, sense of connection. Residents shared stories of their experiences in the town, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Lisa listened intently, responding with empathy and sincerity that slowly won over even some of her harshest critics. For the first time in days, she felt like she was making real progress. Karen, however, sat rigidly at the back of the room, her irritation mounting. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. Lisa was supposed to falter, to crumble under the weight of the questions and accusations. But instead, she was turning the tide, and Karen could feel her carefully constructed narrative slipping through her fingers. Then, an older man in the audience stood up. His name was Frank, a longtime resident who had seen the town evolve over decades. His voice, though gravelly with age, carried authority. "I've lived here for 50 years, he began, "and I've seen this town divided before. It never leads to anything good. Mayor Monroe, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's going to take more than words to bring us together." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right, Frank. Words are just the beginning. Actions are what matter, and I'm committed to proving that through my work." Frank's gaze softened, but before he could respond, Karen stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Actions? Is that what you call covering up your past mistakes? You talk about unity, but how can anyone trust you when you've already shown you're willing to bend the rules to suit yourself?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Karen. Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Lisa met her gaze, her calm composure unwavering. "Karen," she said evenly, "I understand your concerns. But I've been transparent about my past, and I've taken responsibility where it was due. What I won't do is let old accusations, proven unfounded, define the work I'm doing now." Karen smirked, folding her arms. "Convenient." At that moment, Reverend Harris stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Ms. Thompson, this gathering is about finding solutions, not perpetuating conflict. If you have something constructive to contribute, we're listening. Otherwise, I ask that you respect the purpose of this meeting." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, a new voice chimed in from the doorway. "I think I might have something to add." The room turned to see a tall, sharply dressed man entering. His presence commanded attention, and as he stepped into the light, Lisa's face registered a flicker of recognition and surprise. It was Daniel Carter, a journalist from her previous city, and someone who had been closely involved in covering the old investigation Karen had used against her. "Daniel," Lisa said, her voice cautious but steady. "What brings you here?" "I heard about what's been happening," Daniel replied, his tone measured. "And I couldn't stay silent. There's more to this story than what's been printed, and I think the people here deserve to know the truth." Karen's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to unease. "What truth?" she demanded. Daniel turned to address the crowd. "Several years ago, I covered the investigation that's been used to question Mayor Monroe's integrity. What most people don't know, or conveniently leave out, is that Lisa was the one who blew the whistle on the mismanagement in her office. She exposed corruption at significant personal and professional risk, and she paid the price for it. The investigation didn't implicate her because she wasn't part of the problem, she was part of the solution." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Daniel continued. "When I saw the article circulating about her, I couldn't stand by and let her reputation be tarnished by people who don't know the full story. Lisa Monroe is one of the most principled leaders I've ever covered." Lisa stood frozen, her emotions a mix of gratitude and relief. Karen, on the other hand, looked pale, her confidence crumbling. She sputtered, searching for a rebuttal, but the weight of the revelation left her grasping at straws. Frank stood again, his voice cutting through the noise. "Is that true, Mayor? You exposed corruption?" Lisa met his gaze, her voice steady but humble. "It's true. I didn't think it was something I needed to highlight because I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The room erupted into applause, the sound swelling with a renewed sense of unity. Karen, overwhelmed and outnumbered, slipped quietly out of the hall, her presence forgotten amidst the celebration of Lisa's vindication. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed and the church hall emptied, Lisa found herself alone with Reverend Harris. Maya, exhausted but happy, had fallen asleep in Sam's arms and been carried to the car. "Thank you," Lisa said to Harris, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you for your support." Harris smiled warmly. "You don't owe me anything, Lisa. Tonight wasn't about politics or reputation. It was about truth and community. And you proved that both still have a place here." As Lisa drove home, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. There was still work to do, bridges to mend and trust to rebuild, but for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. What Lisa didn't know was that Daniel's arrival wasn't entirely coincidental. Back in his hotel room, he opened his laptop, scrolling through an email thread with a cryptic subject line, "New lead, Karen Thompson's backstory." He clicked it open, his eyes narrowing as he read the contents. It seemed Karen had more to hide than anyone realized. And this time, Lisa wouldn't have to fight the battle on her own. The town buzzed in the days following the community event at the church. Lisa's reputation, once teetering on the brink, had been bolstered by Daniel's revelation and her own candid words. Neighbors stopped her on the street to thank her for her honesty, and social media lit up with posts defending her leadership. Still, the undercurrent of tension hadn't entirely faded. Karen's exit from the meeting had been abrupt, and her silence since was uncharacteristic. Something about it didn't sit right with Lisa. Daniel, too, lingered in town longer than expected. Though his official reason was to visit old friends, Lisa suspected there was more to his presence. On the third day after the church meeting, he called her, his tone cautious but direct. "Lisa," he said, "I think there's something you need to see. Can we meet?" Curiosity piqued, Lisa agreed. They met at a small cafe just outside town. Daniel arrived with a folder tucked under his arm, his expression serious. He placed it on the table between them and leaned in. "This," he said, "is what Karen didn't want anyone to find out." Lisa hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were copies of legal documents, emails, and signed affidavits. As she skimmed the contents, her stomach turned. It detailed Karen's involvement in a series of shady real estate deals that had forced vulnerable families out of their homes. Karen had used her influence in HOAs to orchestrate evictions, flipping properties for profit through a shell company registered under her husband's name. "This is..." Lisa trailed off, her mind reeling. "This is huge. But how did you get this?" Daniel shrugged. "Anonymous tip. I verified as much as I could. It's solid." Lisa closed the folder and looked up at him. "If this gets out, it'll destroy her." Daniel nodded. "I know. But it's your call. I wanted you to have it first." Lisa sat back, torn. Karen's actions were indefensible, but she knew that exposing them would be seen by some as vindictive, a personal attack rather than a stand for justice. Was it worth escalating the feud? "I need to think," she said finally, sliding the folder back to Daniel. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." Daniel respected her hesitation. "Take your time. But remember, the people she hurt deserve justice, too." Back at home, Lisa found herself deep in thought. Maya, sensing her mother's preoccupation, tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, are you okay?" Lisa smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a lot on my mind." Maya tilted her head, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Is it about that mean lady?" Lisa laughed softly, marveling at her daughter's intuition. "Something like that. But it's nothing you need to worry about." Maya seemed satisfied with the answer, skipping off to play with her toys. Lisa watched her, reminded of why she fought so hard for integrity and fairness. Whatever she decided, it had to be something she could explain to her daughter someday. The next day, Lisa called Sam and Reverend Harris to her office. She laid out the situation, showing them the folder and explaining what Daniel had uncovered. Both men listened intently, their reactions a mix of shock and concern. "This is a bombshell," Sam said, shaking his head. "If we use it, Karen's done. But the backlash could be intense. People might accuse you of going for revenge." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "Lisa, you've built a reputation on being principled. Whatever you decide, it has to align with who you are." Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't want to stoop to her level. But I also can't ignore this. She's hurt people, and she's still trying to manipulate this town." After a long silence, Harris spoke again. "Then let the truth speak for itself. You don't need to be the one to release this. Let the families who were affected have their voices heard." Lisa considered his words. It was a way to hold Karen accountable without making it personal. "You're right," she said finally. "The people she hurt deserve to tell their stories. And I'll make sure they have a platform to do it." The following week, a new article hit the local news, this time written by Daniel. It focused not on Karen directly but on the families she had wronged, weaving their stories into a larger narrative about abuse of power and the need for accountability. The article was careful to include verified facts and documentation, ensuring its credibility. Karen's name appeared only sparingly, mentioned as a central figure in the events but not the sole focus. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Residents were horrified by the revelations, and public opinion quickly turned against Karen. Protests erupted at the next HOA meeting, with neighbors demanding her resignation. Karen, cornered and unable to refute the evidence, stepped down from her position within days. Lisa, meanwhile, stayed out of the spotlight, focusing instead on her work as mayor. She met with some of the families affected by Karen's schemes, offering her support and ensuring they had access to legal and financial resources. The gesture wasn't about optics, it was about doing what was right. Weeks later, Lisa stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd gathered for a community celebration. The mood was lighter than it had been in months, the town beginning to heal from the divisions that had plagued it. "I've learned a lot over these past few weeks," Lisa said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "About resilience, about accountability, and about the power of community. We've faced challenges, but we've come through stronger because we faced them together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lisa stepped back, letting the moment sink in. As she scanned the faces before her, she spotted Daniel near the back, giving her a small nod. She smiled, grateful for his unexpected support. Maya, sitting on the front steps with Sam, waved enthusiastically. Lisa laughed, waving back. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. That evening, as the town celebrated, Lisa sat on her porch, watching Maya chase fireflies in the yard. Sam joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You did good, Lisa," he said, sitting beside her. "We did good," she corrected, smiling at him. As they sat in comfortable silence, Lisa reflected on the journey they'd been through. The challenges had been daunting, the conflicts messy, but in the end, truth and integrity had prevailed. The town wasn't perfect, no place was, but it was a place worth fighting for. And as Maya's laughter echoed through the night, Lisa knew she wouldn't have it any other way. It was a busy afternoon at Ridgeway General Hospital, the kind of day where the air felt thick with urgency. Nurses bustled in and out of patient rooms, doctors flipped through charts with practiced efficiency, and the faint hum of medical equipment formed an ever-present backdrop. Among the chaos, Nurse Mia Bennett moved with quiet confidence. Her scrubs were perfectly pressed, her posture straight, and her presence calm and professional, even amidst the whirlwind of activity. Mia was used to being overlooked in the hospital's hierarchy. As a black nurse in a facility where she was one of the few, she had grown accustomed to the occasional dismissive tone or sidelong glance. But her dedication to her patients never wavered. She had a warmth that made even the most nervous patients relax, her ability to listen often doing as much good as the medicine she administered. On this particular day, she was assigned to room 214, a private suite reserved for high-profile patients. The hospital had been abuzz with whispers about the man occupying the room, a patient who had checked in under an alias but was clearly someone of importance. The details were scarce, but the word executive had been murmured enough times to raise curiosity. Mia had barely stepped into the room when Dr. Greg Foster entered behind her. A senior physician with years of experience, Dr. Foster had a reputation for his sharp medical skills and his equally sharp tongue. He was brilliant, no doubt, but his bedside manner often left much to be desired. Mia had worked with him enough times to know he had little patience for anyone he deemed beneath him, nurses, interns, and sometimes even the patients themselves. "Did you even check his vitals properly, Nurse Bennett?" Dr. Foster barked as he walked in, not bothering with a greeting. His tone was loud, curt, and dismissive, a verbal slap in front of the man lying in the hospital bed. Mia's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. "Yes, doctor," she replied evenly, handing over the clipboard. "His vitals are stable, but he mentioned feeling lightheaded earlier." "I thought it was worth noting," Dr. Foster cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I'll decide what's worth noting, thank you," he snapped, barely glancing at the chart. "Next time, try not to waste my time with irrelevant details." The patient in the bed, an older man with a sharp gaze and a calm demeanor, watched the exchange without a word. He had a presence about him, something that hinted at authority, even in his hospital gown. Though his face betrayed no emotion, his eyes flicked between Mia and Dr. Foster with quiet intensity. Mia's grip tightened around the clipboard, but she refused to let Dr. Foster's words rattle her. She'd learned long ago that standing her ground with grace often spoke louder than a heated retort. Instead, she focused on the patient, offering him a kind smile. "Mr. Smith," she said, using the name on the chart, "if there's anything else you need, just press the call button, and I'll be here right away." Dr. Foster scoffed. "If he needs anything, he'll get it from someone more competent," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for both Mia and the patient to hear. Mia swallowed the lump rising in her throat, her professionalism keeping her rooted. She nodded to the patient and left the room quietly, her footsteps measured and steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Once she was gone, the room fell into a thick silence. Dr. Foster began flipping through the chart, still muttering about incompetent staff and wasting his time. The patient watched him for a moment longer, then spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "Tell me, doctor," he began, his tone as calm as it was piercing, "do you always speak to your staff that way?" Dr. Foster froze, the chart lowering just slightly. He glanced at the man, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the doctor's pride was a stubborn thing, and he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "I speak to them as they deserve," he replied dismissively, turning back to the chart. "Now, let's focus on your condition, shall we?" The patient's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, we'll focus on that soon enough," he said, his voice laced with an undertone that made Dr. Foster pause. "But first, let me tell you a little bit about myself." Dr. Foster finally looked up, the chart forgotten in his hands. For the first time in years, he found himself caught off guard, his confidence wavering under the weight of the patient's steady gaze. What followed next would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about respect, humility, and the true cost of arrogance. Mia made her way down the brightly lit corridor, her steps quick and deliberate. She didn't let the sting of Dr. Foster's words show, but deep down, she could feel the familiar ache creeping in. It wasn't the first time someone like him had belittled her, and she doubted it would be the last. Her hands gripped the edges of the clipboard tighter, knuckles whitening. She reminded herself of why she chose this profession, to help people, to make a difference, and not to prove her worth to people who refused to see it. She stopped at the nurse's station, setting the clipboard down with a soft thud. Lisa, one of her colleagues, glanced up from the monitor she was typing on. "You okay?" Lisa asked, her brow furrowing slightly as she noticed the tension in Mia's jaw. Mia forced a small smile, brushing it off. "Yeah, just another round with Dr. Foster." Lisa rolled her eyes knowingly. "That man's ego is bigger than this hospital. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Mia replied, though the tightness in her chest told a different story. Meanwhile, back in room 214, the tension between the patient and Drive Foster thickened. The doctor stood by the window, pretending to focus on the man's test results, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. "So," the patient said casually, breaking the silence, "is that how you treat all your staff? Or just the ones you think can't push back?" Dr. Foster turned, his expression hardening. "I treat my staff how they deserve," he repeated firmly. "This is a high-pressure environment, Mr. Smith. If someone can't handle constructive criticism, they shouldn't be here." The patient chuckled softly, the sound more amused than warm. "Constructive? That's what you call it?" He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You must be very good at justifying your actions, doctor. I wonder how often that's worked for you." Dr. Foster stiffened, his pride flaring. "I'm here to ensure the best care for my patients, not to discuss my management style." "Interesting," the man mused, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Because from what I just witnessed, you seem more interested in tearing down the people who help you. Tell me, doctor, where would you be without your nurses?" Dr. Foster's lips pressed into a thin line, his temper barely contained. "With all due respect, Mr. Smith, I don't think this conversation is relevant to your treatment." "Oh, I think it's very relevant," the man said, his tone hardening slightly. "Especially when you realize who I am." Dr. Foster faltered, his confidence visibly cracking. He studied the patient, searching for a clue, anything that might reveal why this man was so self-assured, why his words carried an edge that cut deeper than the usual complaints he brushed off. But before he could speak, the man continued. "You checked me in under an alias," he said, his voice low but commanding. A smart move, considering my position. But let me make one thing clear, you have no idea who you're dealing with, Dr. Foster. Dr. Foster's throat tightened, the weight of the man's words sinking in. Who? Who are you? He asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with uncertainty. The patient didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, his gaze never leaving Dr. Foster's. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room despite his weakened physical state. Let's just say, he began, his voice cold and deliberate, the decisions I make can change lives, yours included. So, if I were you, I'd think carefully about how you speak to people. Because today might be the day you learn just how small this world can be. Dr. Foster's face paled as the weight of the man's words pressed down on him. For the first time in his career, he felt a flicker of doubt, not about his medical abilities, but about the way he carried himself, the way he treated those around him. And yet, even as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him, he couldn't shake the nagging voice in his head that insisted he was untouchable. After all, he was Dr. Greg Foster, one of the most respected physicians in the hospital. What could this man, whoever he was, possibly do to him? But as the patient's sharp gaze held his, Dr. Foster couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that his arrogance had finally led him somewhere he couldn't escape. The hospital hallway outside room 214 buzzed with its usual energy, but Mia found herself pausing at the corner. She leaned briefly against the wall, her eyes fixed on the clipboard in her hands, not really seeing the words on the page. Her thoughts lingered on the man in the bed and the strange undercurrent in the room when she'd left. Something about him, the way he carried himself, the calm yet commanding presence, felt out of place. Patients usually displayed some vulnerability, but this man seemed like someone who rarely, if ever, found himself in a position of weakness. She took a steadying breath and straightened her shoulders. Dwelling on these things wasn't going to make her shift any easier. She had plenty of other patients who needed her care, and there wasn't time to let Dr. Foster's condescension or her own curiosity distract her. But as she walked away, the memory of the man's measured smile lingered, nagging at the back of her mind. Inside the room, Dr. Foster had regained a shred of his composure, though unease still clung to him like a shadow. The man, Mr. Smith, as far as the chart stated, had settled back into his bed, watching the doctor with an expression that seemed equal parts amusement and warning. "I don't have time for games, Mr. Smith," Dr. Foster said, attempting to assert himself again. "If there's something about your condition I need to know, now's the time to tell me. Otherwise, I suggest we focus on your treatment." The patient tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the doctor's words. "Oh, I assure you, my condition is just fine," he said with a faint smile. "But perhaps your focus is better spent elsewhere. Like on how you speak to the people keeping this hospital running." Dr. Foster bristled but chose not to take the bait this time. He scribbled a note on the chart, his pen moving faster than usual, betraying his irritation. "If you're done dispensing life lessons," he said without looking up, "I'll send someone in to take your blood work." The man's smile widened, just enough to unsettle the doctor. "You do that, doctor. I'll be right here, thinking about what comes next." Dr. Foster snapped the chart shut and walked out, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. As the door swung closed behind him, the patient's gaze lingered on it for a moment before he leaned back into the pillows, his expression turning thoughtful. Down the hall, Mia was preparing a cart with supplies for her next patient when Dr. Foster approached, his face tight with frustration. He stopped at the station, giving her a pointed look. "Nurse Bennett," he said sharply, "make sure the lab prioritizes Mr. Smith's tests. I don't want any delays." Mia looked up, startled by his tone, but nodded. "Of course, doctor. I'll take care of it right away. And next time," he added, lowering his voice but keeping the edge, "if you're going to note symptoms, make sure they're relevant. I don't need distractions when I'm dealing with high-profile patients." She bit the inside of her cheek, resisting the urge to respond in kind. Instead, she kept her voice steady. "Understood, doctor." Dr. Foster didn't wait for a reply, striding off toward his office with the same clipped steps. Lisa, who had overheard the exchange, sidled up to Mia as she wheeled the cart away. "What's his problem today?" Lisa asked under her breath. Mia sighed. "Same as always. But Mr. Smith? There's something different about him. Did you hear anything about who he might be?" Lisa shook her head. "Not really, just that admin's been unusually quiet about his stay. That usually means money or influence, or both." "Why? Did he say something?" "Not much," Mia admitted, "but he doesn't act like a typical patient. It's like I don't know, like he's watching everything. And not just in a curious way. Lisa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Maybe he's one of those CEO types. They're always sizing people up, figuring out how to get the upper hand. Could be a corporate big shot recovering from stress or surgery. Maybe, Mia said, though she wasn't convinced. As the evening progressed, the hospital began to quiet down, the frenetic energy of the day giving way to the hum of machines and the soft murmurs of night staff. Mia's thoughts kept drifting back to room 214. She couldn't explain why, but something about the whole situation felt off. The way Dr. Foster had acted, the tension in the air, the strange confidence of the patient, it all seemed like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. Later that night, Mia found herself passing by the room again, her steps slowing instinctively. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated, torn between curiosity and professionalism. Finally, she tapped lightly and stepped inside. "Mr. Smith?" she asked softly, careful not to disturb him if he was asleep. The man was awake, sitting upright in bed with a tablet in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening when he saw her. "Nurse Bennett," he said warmly. "Back to check on me?" She smiled politely, stepping closer. "Just making my rounds. I wanted to see how you were feeling." "Better," he said, setting the tablet aside. "Thanks to you, I suspect. You seem like the kind of person who takes their work seriously." "I try," she replied, a hint of unease creeping into her voice. He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Tell me, Mia, may I call you Mia?" She nodded hesitantly. "Tell me, Mia," he continued, "do you enjoy working here?" The question caught her off guard. "I do," she said carefully. "It's challenging, but I like helping people." "I can see that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You have a presence about you. Compassion, intelligence. A rarity in places like this." Mia felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Thank you. That means a lot." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Then why do you let people like Dr. Foster treat you the way he does?" Mia froze, the question cutting deeper than she expected. She looked away, trying to find the right words. "I don't let it bother me," she said finally. "He's difficult, but it's not about me. It's about the patients." The man nodded, though his eyes darkened slightly. "Admirable. But let me give you a piece of advice, don't let people like that go unchecked. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about you. It's about changing the way others see the world." Mia frowned, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, the man leaned back against the pillows, his expression softening again. "Thank you for checking on me," he said, the conversation seemingly closed. She nodded, turning to leave, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Oh, and Mia?" he called, his tone light but carrying an undeniable weight. She turned back, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Remember," he said with a faint smile, "the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences." Mia left the room with a strange sense of unease, her thoughts swirling with questions. Who was this man? And why did it feel like he knew far more about her, and the hospital, than he let on? The air in the hospital seemed heavier the next day, though it was hard to pinpoint why. Mia couldn't shake the lingering unease from her conversation with Mr. Smith, and as she moved through her tasks, she noticed small, subtle changes. Staff whispered in clusters near the nurses' station, their glances darting toward room 214. The usual rhythm of the hospital felt interrupted, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Mia avoided the chatter as much as she could. She focused on her patients, pouring her energy into checking vitals, adjusting 4 lines, and offering reassurances to worried families. Still, the tension was inescapable, pressing against her every time she passed the room where Mr. Smith rested. By mid-afternoon, she found herself at the nurses' station again, updating charts. Lisa approached, her voice low but insistent. "Have you heard?" Lisa asked, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "Heard what?" Mia replied, keeping her tone neutral. "About Smith," Lisa said. "Apparently, admin's been fielding calls all day. Someone high up, really high up, is keeping tabs on him." Mia frowned, unsure how to respond. "That's unusual," she said carefully. Lisa nodded, leaning closer. "Unusual doesn't even cover it. I don't know who he is, but whatever he's involved in, it's got the higher-ups spooked. Even Dr. Foster's been quieter than usual. Did you notice? He hasn't barked at anyone all morning." Mia had noticed but hadn't connected it to Mr. Smith. "What do you think he's here for?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "No clue," Lisa said, straightening as Dr. Foster himself rounded the corner. The doctor's expression was unreadable, his usual sharpness tempered by something close to caution. He barely acknowledged the nurses as he passed, heading straight for room 214. Lisa and Mia exchanged a look, then returned to their work, though Mia's thoughts were far from focused. Inside the room, Dr. Foster found Mr. Smith seated upright, his tablet in hand once again. The man looked up as the doctor entered, his expression unreadable. "Doctor," Mr. Smith said, his tone polite but cool. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Dr. Foster hesitated, a rare occurrence for the usually confident physician. "I wanted to check in personally," he said, his voice measured. "Make sure everything is progressing as it should." Mr. Smith raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "How considerate of you. Is this standard practice, or am I just lucky?" Foster cleared his throat, choosing to ignore the jab. "Your tests have come back normal so far, but we're running a few additional panels. I want to ensure there's no underlying condition we might have missed." "Of course," Mr. Smith said, setting the tablet aside. "Though I suspect there's more on your mind than my test results." The doctor stiffened, the man's calm demeanor unnerving him. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," Mr. Smith said, his gaze steady. "You're a man who values control, Dr. Foster. But control is a fragile thing, isn't it?" Foster's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened, and a hospital administrator stepped in. The tension in the room shifted instantly as the administrator, a middle-aged woman with a professional but strained expression, addressed Mr. Smith directly. "Mr. Smith," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I wanted to personally ensure your stay has been comfortable. Is there anything you need?" Dr. Foster's eyes widened slightly. It was rare for administrators to involve themselves directly with patients unless there was an extraordinary reason. Mr. Smith's smile returned, warmer this time but still guarded. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. Everything has been satisfactory so far. I appreciate the attention." "Of course," she said quickly, glancing at Dr. Foster as though to gauge his reaction. "If there's anything at all, you require, please don't hesitate to let us know." She excused herself shortly after, leaving Dr. Foster feeling even more unsettled than before. As the day stretched on, Mia couldn't avoid being drawn into the growing mystery. After her shift ended, she found herself lingering in the break room, her thoughts spinning. What kind of man could command such attention? And why did it feel like he was orchestrating something, pulling strings in a way no ordinary patient could? Lisa joined her after a while, her usual humor replaced with a serious expression. "Mia, I don't know about you, but I think this is bigger than we realize," she said, sitting across from her. "What do you mean?" Mia asked, though she had her own suspicions. "Think about it," Lisa said. "All this attention, the weird vibes in admin, even Foster acting like he's on eggshells. Something's happening, and it's connected to that man." Mia nodded slowly. "I just don't understand what he could want. He doesn't seem sick, at least not in the usual way. And the way he talks. It's like he knows more than he's letting on." Lisa leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Do you think he's some kind of undercover investigator? Maybe for the government or something?" Mia hesitated. The thought hadn't occurred to her, but now that Lisa mentioned it, it didn't seem impossible. "Whatever he is," Mia said finally, "it's clear he's here for more than treatment. And I have a feeling we're going to find out sooner rather than later." Neither of them noticed Dr. Foster passing by the break room, his expression dark as he overheard the tail end of their conversation. The doctor's mind was racing, piecing together fragments of interactions and whispers. He didn't like being kept in the dark, and he certainly didn't like the idea of being evaluated by someone he couldn't control. For the first time in years, Dr. Foster felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Doubt. Doubt about his decisions, about his approach, and most troubling of all, about what might come next. The night shift had its own rhythm, quieter but no less intense. Mia found herself once again drawn toward room 214. It wasn't part of her duties tonight, but curiosity gnawed at her, mixed with a strange sense of responsibility. She told herself it was professional concern, a need to ensure her patient was cared for. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Mr. Smith's presence lingered in her thoughts like a puzzle she couldn't solve. The hallways were dimly lit, the sounds of distant monitors and hushed voices creating an almost eerie ambience. As she approached the room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light onto the tiled floor. Her heart quickened as she stepped closer, unsure of what she might find. Inside, Mr. Smith was not asleep. He was seated on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in a simple but elegant suit, his posture relaxed yet alert. A briefcase rested beside him on the bed, and he was scrolling through his tablet with a focused expression. "Working late, Nurse Bennett?" he said without looking up, his voice cutting through the quiet. Mia froze for a moment, caught off guard by how he always seemed to anticipate her presence. "I was just checking in," she said hesitantly. "You're dressed. Are you leaving?" He set the tablet down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Not just yet. But soon, I think. My business here is almost concluded." "Business?" she echoed, stepping into the room. "I thought you were here for treatment." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "We all have our reasons for being where we are, don't we? Some are just less obvious than others." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in his tone, an undercurrent of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "If there's something you're not telling us, something about your health, we need to know. We can't help you if we don't have the full picture." "You're a very dedicated nurse," he said, his smile softening slightly. "But don't worry, Mia. I assure you, I'm in excellent hands." The way he said her name made her pause. It wasn't unusual for patients to address her personally, but coming from him, it felt different. Intimate, almost, as though he knew her far better than he should. "Why are you here, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Really?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He stood, picking up the briefcase and placing it on the bed. When he turned back to her, his expression was calm but serious. "Let's just say I'm observing," he said finally. "Taking note of how people behave when they think no one's watching. It's enlightening." Mia's brow furrowed. "Observing what? The staff? The hospital?" "Everything," he replied simply. Before she could press him further, the door swung open, and Dr. Foster entered, his expression tight with frustration. He stopped short when he saw Mia, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing here, Nurse Bennett?" he demanded. Mia straightened, her professional demeanor snapping into place. "I was checking on Mr. Smith, doctor. I noticed he was awake." Foster's gaze shifted to Mr. Smith, who remained standing by the bed, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the doctor's irritation. "Is there a problem, doctor?" Mr. Smith asked, his tone polite but with an edge that made Foster hesitate. "No," Foster said quickly, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "But it's late. You should be resting." Mr. Smith chuckled softly. "Rest is a luxury, doctor. And one I'll indulge in soon enough." Foster's irritation deepened, but before he could respond, Mr. Smith reached for his briefcase and opened it. He pulled out a sleek envelope and handed it to the doctor. "What's this?" Foster asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Consider it an opportunity," Mr. Smith said, his tone light. "One I hope you'll take." Foster hesitated before taking the envelope. He didn't open it, but his grip on it tightened as though he could feel the weight of whatever was inside. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Life often is," Mr. Smith replied, his smile returning. Foster glanced at Mia, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Mr. Smith. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." "Of course," Mr. Smith said smoothly. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere just yet." Foster left without another word, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Mia watched him go, her unease growing with every passing moment. When she turned back to Mr. Smith, he was already sitting back on the bed, the briefcase closed and placed neatly at his side. "You have a way of making people uncomfortable," Mia said, unable to keep the words from slipping out. Mr. Smith looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Only those who have something to hide." Mia's breath caught, but before she could respond, he lay back against the pillows, closing his eyes as though signaling the conversation was over. She stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing, before quietly leaving the room. As she walked back to the nurse's station, her thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. What was in the envelope? Who was Mr. Smith, really? And why did she feel like she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than she could comprehend? The next morning, the hospital buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel but no one could explain. Mia arrived early, her mind still tangled with the events of the previous night. As she passed the nurse's station, she overheard snippets of hushed conversations. "Foster's been in meetings all morning," someone said. "Something about that patient in 214. Mia tried to focus on her tasks, but the knot in her stomach tightened with every passing hour. She noticed small, unusual details. Security seemed heavier in the halls near Mr. Smith's room. Administrators moved through the ward more frequently, their faces tight with stress. And though Dr. Foster usually made his rounds by mid-morning, he was nowhere to be seen. Around noon, Lisa caught up with Mia in the break room. Her face was flushed, her usual playful demeanor replaced by a serious urgency. "You won't believe this," Lisa said, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I just overheard Foster talking to Carter. He's furious. Whatever was in that envelope, it's got him completely shaken." Mia leaned closer, her heart racing. "Did you hear what it was?" Lisa shook her head. "Not exactly, but it sounded like some kind of ultimatum. Foster kept saying he couldn't be expected to make a decision like this overnight. Carter was trying to calm him down, but it didn't sound good." Mia frowned, her unease deepening. Mr. Smith had been cryptic, but she hadn't expected him to have this much power. What kind of decision could leave someone like Dr. Foster so rattled? By mid-afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. Mia decided to check on Mr. Smith herself. She found him sitting in his usual spot, looking impossibly composed. His tablet rested on the table beside him, but he wasn't using it. Instead, he seemed to be staring out the window, lost in thought. "Still observing?" Mia asked, trying to keep her tone light as she stepped into the room. He turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Always." Dr. Foster seemed upset this morning, she ventured, hoping to coax some kind of explanation out of him. "Did he?" Mr. Smith asked, tilting his head slightly. "Interesting," Mia sighed, feeling frustration bubble to the surface. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but it's affecting everyone. If there's something you can tell me, something that might help." He raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "You're a good person, Mia. That much is clear. But sometimes, the best way to help is to simply stay out of the way." She stared at him, stunned into silence by his bluntness. Before she could respond, the door opened, and two men in suits entered the room. They moved with the kind of quiet authority that immediately set Mia on edge. "Mr. Smith," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to speak with you." "Of course," Mr. Smith replied, his smile never faltering. He glanced at Mia. "Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time." Mia nodded stiffly, her instincts screaming at her to stay but knowing she had no excuse to linger. As she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't help but glance back. The two men closed the door behind them, cutting off her view. The rest of the day felt like an eternity. Every time she passed by Mr. Smith's room, the door remained closed, with no sign of the suited men leaving. Dr. Foster was still avoiding the floor, and even Lisa seemed more subdued than usual. By the time her shift ended, Mia's nerves were frayed. She lingered in the staff locker room, trying to convince herself to go home. But as she changed out of her scrubs, she realized she couldn't leave. Not yet. The hospital was quieter in the evening, the usual bustle of the day shift replaced by a more subdued energy. Mia made her way back to the ward, careful to avoid drawing attention to herself. She paused outside room 214, her heart pounding as she listened at the door. She couldn't hear much, muffled voices, low and intense. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she gently pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Mr. Smith was still seated on the bed, but his demeanor had shifted. He no longer seemed relaxed or amused. Instead, he looked every bit the powerful figure she had suspected he might be, his expression sharp and commanding. The two men in suits stood on either side of him, their faces unreadable. One of them held a folder, which he handed to Mr. Smith with a small nod. Mia's breath caught as she saw Mr. Smith open the folder and scan its contents. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he closed it with a decisive snap. "Everything is in place," he said, his voice carrying an authority that sent chills down Mia's spine. "We move forward as planned." The men nodded in unison, and one of them glanced toward the door. Mia stepped back quickly, her heart racing as she retreated down the hallway. She didn't stop until she reached the stairwell, her mind spinning with questions. What was in place? What were they planning? And how did it all connect to the strange tension that had gripped the hospital over the past few days? As Mia leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to catch her breath, she realized one thing with absolute certainty: whatever was happening, it was far bigger than she could have imagined. And somehow, she was caught in the middle of it. Mia stayed in the stairwell for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady her breathing and make sense of what she'd just witnessed. She replayed the scene in her head, the calm authority in Mr. Smith's voice, the unspoken agreement among the men in suits, the ominous words, "Everything is in place." Her instincts screamed that this wasn't just hospital politics. It was something bigger, something dangerous. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and saw a message from Lisa. "Where are you? Foster's asking for you. Something's going on with 214. Mia's stomach churned. She wasn't ready to face Dr. Foster, not when her mind was swimming with unanswered questions. But avoiding him would only raise suspicion. Steeling herself, she made her way to the nurse's station. Lisa was waiting for her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped seriousness. "Foster's in his office," she said quietly. "He doesn't look good. Whatever's going on with Mr. Smith, it's eating him alive." Mia nodded and headed to the office, her palms damp with sweat. She knocked lightly on the door, and Foster's sharp voice called out, "Come in." Inside, the room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn. Dr. Foster sat at his desk, his tie loosened and his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed vulnerable. "Nurse Bennett," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated but complied, her heart pounding. "I need to ask you something," he began, his voice unusually soft. "Have you noticed anything strange about Mr. Smith?" Mia's throat went dry. She considered lying, brushing off the question with something vague. But the weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she found herself nodding. "I have," she admitted. "He's different. And the way you've been acting around him, it's like you're scared of him." Foster's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Scared isn't the right word," he said finally. "Cautious, maybe. Do you know who he is?" Mia shook her head, her pulse quickening. "He's not just a patient," Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's connected. Powerful. The kind of person who can ruin lives with a phone call. And for some reason, he's chosen to test me." "Test you?" Mia echoed, her confusion growing. Foster opened a drawer and pulled out the envelope Mr. Smith had given him. He slid it across the desk to her. "This," he said, "is what's been keeping me up all night." Mia hesitated before picking up the envelope. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling, and pulled out the contents, a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the page, and her breath caught. It was a contract. At first glance, it looked innocuous, something about hospital policy and patient care protocols. But as she read further, the implications became clear. Mr. Smith wasn't just evaluating his own treatment, he was evaluating the entire hospital, its staff, its leadership. And the consequences of failing his test were staggering. "He's a high-level consultant," Foster explained, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Sent here to decide whether this hospital is worth saving or if it's better off being dismantled. And everything we've done, every decision we've made, has been under his microscope." Mia stared at the paper, her mind racing. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because he asked me not to," Foster said. "And because I was afraid of what he'd do if I didn't comply." Mia's thoughts spiraled. She thought of the patients, the staff, the countless lives that would be affected if the hospital shut down. And then she thought of Mr. Smith, sitting calmly in his room, pulling strings like a puppet master. "This isn't right," she said, her voice firm. "He shouldn't have this much power over us," Foster sighed, looking more defeated than she'd ever seen him. "Maybe not. But what can we do? He's already made up his mind. All we can do now is wait for the fallout." Mia clenched her fists, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "There has to be a way to fight this," she said. "We can't just roll over and let him destroy everything." Foster didn't answer. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and despair. As Mia left the office, her resolve hardened. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let Mr. Smith win without a fight. She returned to the ward, her mind racing with possibilities. The hospital felt different now, the familiar halls suddenly tinged with a sense of impending doom. Every interaction, every decision, seemed to carry more weight. And as she passed room 214, she felt his eyes on her, sharp and unyielding, as if he already knew what she was planning. Mia spent the next several hours pacing her small apartment, replaying everything in her mind. Mr. Smith's calm demeanor, Foster's unease, the ominous contract, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. She tried to think of someone who could help, someone who might have answers, but every idea led to the same dead end. What did she really know about Mr. Smith? Who could she trust in a situation like this? As the city outside her window buzzed with life, Mia sat down at her kitchen table, opening her laptop. If Mr. Smith was as powerful as Foster implied, there had to be something about him online. She typed his name into the search bar, hesitating for a moment before hitting enter. The results were sparse, which was strange enough on its own. A man with that much influence should have at least some presence, articles, interviews, even a social media footprint. But the pages she found were vague, his name appearing in scattered reports tied to corporate audits or high-profile lawsuits. He was always mentioned briefly, never the focus. Then she saw it, a single headline buried on the third page of search results: "Whistleblower vanishes after exposing corruption at major hospital chain." Her heart skipped a beat. The article was from years ago, detailing a case where a consultant had uncovered massive financial fraud in a hospital group. The consultant, unnamed in the piece, had disappeared shortly after making his findings public. The story had been quietly swept under the rug, no follow-ups, no further details. Mia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Could Mr. Smith have been involved? Was that why he seemed so untouchable? And if so, what kind of danger had Foster, and by extension, she, stumbled into by questioning him? The next morning, Mia returned to work with a newfound sense of urgency. The hospital felt heavier, the tension in the air almost palpable. Staff whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward room 214 as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. Mia's every step felt deliberate as she made her way to Lisa, who was busy logging vitals into a chart at the nurse's station. "You're not going to believe this," Mia whispered, pulling Lisa aside. She quickly recounted what she'd found, her voice low but insistent. Lisa's eyes widened, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That's insane," Lisa said. "You think he's here to do the same thing? Blow the whistle on something?" "Maybe," Mia replied. "Or maybe he's here to do something worse." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices down the hall. Mia turned to see Dr. Foster standing outside Mr. Smith's room, his face flushed with anger. One of the suited men stood in front of him, calm but unyielding, blocking the door. "This is my hospital," Foster said through gritted teeth. "You don't get to dictate how I run it." "Your hospital?" the man replied, his voice cold. "Not for long." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Lisa, who looked just as unsettled. Without thinking, Mia started down the hallway, her curiosity overriding her caution. She stopped just short of the confrontation, close enough to hear but far enough to avoid drawing attention. "You think you're untouchable," Foster continued, his voice shaking with frustration. "But I won't let you ruin everything I've built here." The suited man smirked. "You've already done that yourself, Doctor. We're just here to clean up the mess." Foster's face fell, his anger replaced by a flicker of fear. Before he could respond, the door to room 214 opened, and Mr. Smith stepped out. He looked at Foster, then at the suited man, and for the first time, Mia saw something crack through his calm exterior. Annoyance. "That's enough," Mr. Smith said, his voice firm but quiet. He turned to Foster, his expression unreadable. "Doctor, I suggest you take a moment to collect yourself. You're not helping your case." Foster hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he eventually turned and walked away without another word. The suited man followed Mr. Smith back into the room, shutting the door behind them. Mia stood frozen in place, her mind spinning. What had Mr. Smith meant by your case? And why did it feel like Foster wasn't the only one being judged? As the day wore on, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, an invisible storm gathering just out of sight. She tried to focus on her work, but every time she passed room 214, her pulse quickened. She wanted to confront Mr. Smith, to demand answers, but a deep, instinctive fear held her back. That evening, as the halls quieted and the staff thinned out, Mia decided she couldn't wait any longer. She made her way to room 214, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She hesitated outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Mr. Smith stood before her, his expression calm but expectant. "Nurse Bennett," he said. "I wondered when you'd come." Mia swallowed hard, her resolve faltering under his steady gaze. "I need to know what's going on," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are you really here? What are you doing to Foster?" Mr. Smith smiled faintly, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in, Mia. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." As she stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Mia stepped into the room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Mr. Smith could hear it. The air inside felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of secrets too large to comprehend. Mr. Smith gestured toward the small chair by the window, but Mia remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "I'll stand," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Start talking. Why are you here, and what do you really want?" Mr. Smith gave a slight nod, as if appreciating her directness. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "You're persistent," he said calmly. "I admire that. It's rare these days." "Stop deflecting," Mia snapped. "You've been playing games with everyone in this hospital. Dr. Foster is barely holding it together, and now you're dragging me into whatever this is. I deserve answers." Mr. Smith's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, approval, perhaps. He folded his hands in his lap and let out a small sigh. "Very well," he said. "But understand this, the truth is far more complicated than you might expect." Mia didn't respond, her silence urging him to continue. "This hospital," Mr. Smith began, "is on the brink of collapse. Financially, ethically, operationally, you name it. Foster has made mistakes, yes, but the problems run deeper than one man's failings. My role here is to assess whether it's worth salvaging or if it should be dismantled entirely." Mia frowned, her mind racing. "You're talking about shutting down the hospital? What happens to the staff? The patients? This place is a lifeline for so many people." "Precisely why I'm here," he replied. "To determine whether those lives are better served by fixing what's broken, or starting fresh elsewhere." Mia shook her head, anger bubbling to the surface. "You're treating this like it's a spreadsheet, like these are just numbers to crunch. But this is people's lives. Their families, their futures. You can't just—" Her voice trailed off as Mr. Smith raised a hand, not to silence her, but to acknowledge her point. "You're right," he said. "This isn't just about numbers. Which is why I look beyond the spreadsheets, to the people. To see who rises to the occasion and who reveals their true colors under pressure." Mia narrowed her eyes. "And that's why you've been targeting Foster? To push him, to test him?" Mr. Smith leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Foster is a complicated man. He's made sacrifices, some noble, others selfish. He's hidden things that could destroy this hospital faster than I ever could." Mia's breath caught. "What kind of things?" Mr. Smith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder on the table beside him, sliding it across to her. "See for yourself," he said. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. Her gut told her that whatever was inside would change everything, but she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. After a moment, she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were documents, financial records, emails, signed contracts. At first, the technical jargon made little sense, but as she pieced it together, a horrifying picture emerged. Misallocated funds, falsified reports, unauthorized surgeries, all connected to Foster. "This can't be real," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wouldn't." "I assure you, it's very real," Mr. Smith said. "Foster's been covering his tracks for years. But the truth always comes out, one way or another." Mia closed the folder, her hands trembling. She felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. Dr. Foster had been difficult, even infuriating at times, but she'd always believed he wanted what was best for the hospital. Now, she wasn't so sure. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "That depends," Mr. Smith said. "If Foster can prove he's capable of change, perhaps there's hope for him. But if not—" He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Mia stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to hate him, to see him as the villain in all of this. But the more he spoke, the harder that became. He wasn't just here to destroy, he was here to uncover the truth. The problem was, the truth might destroy them all. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. One of the suited men entered, his expression grave. "We have a situation," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Mia before focusing on Mr. Smith. "What kind of situation?" Mr. Smith asked, his tone calm but sharp. "The files," the man said. "They've been leaked." Mia's heart dropped. She looked at Mr. Smith, whose expression remained unreadable. "Leaked? What does that mean?" she asked, her voice rising. "It means," Mr. Smith said, standing slowly, "that someone has decided to escalate this far beyond what I intended. And now, the real game begins." Mia's chest tightened as she watched him move to the door, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Stay close, Nurse Bennett," he said over his shoulder. "Things are about to get very complicated." And with that, he was gone, leaving Mia alone in the room with nothing but the damning folder and a sense that she was in far deeper than she'd ever imagined. Mia's pulse quickened as she rushed out of the room.